Welcome back to Roundtail Restoration, everybody. My name is Chris. Next to me here is the gearbox for my Triumph TR4 that I'm rebuilding. Most of the way done. The overdrive is not installed yet, but you can see I got the top cover on temporarily for now, but it will shift through all the gears into reverse, and it operates, and it seems to work just fine. So pretty excited with how the rebuild went, and the put it back together stuff, and everything looks pretty good. So not too shabby for my second transmission rebuild. So hang around, I'll show you how I did it. Thanks for watching. Let's get it sorted. Next big step here is to start putting everything together. So I've already got the thrust washer on down at the bottom there. So that goes on first, and you notice I have it in the overdrive units just because it's convenient for me to stand this up this way. So this is just like the mock-up for looking at the Greasy Hands garage. Is just like the mock-up for setting up the total float measurement that I just did not too long ago. Except now I'm actually going to put some gears on here, which is exciting. So we're going to go ahead and install the washer, which is this guy, thrust washer. Second and third gears, so we'll get those guys out. Then we have second gear and the top hat bushing. And they're nice and pretty. Check this second gear out, make sure I got nothing weird going on. No big chunks in here. Then we'll follow up with the third gear bushing and third gear. That looks good. I'm going to get some oil in here actually. So as I had shown you when I was putting the bushing float on, I said that the flat goes up top. Well, if you do that, then there's no spot for the slip ring to go on. So that's obviously not going to work. So this would have been self-correcting, and I would have figured it out. But you've got to put it with the cupped end on. And I did ask the question of my favorite form, and I almost got an immediate response to say cup end in, and you'll figure it out when you get there that you can't do it the other way. So there you go. That's how you figured it out. So that was convenient. So now the circlip itself, and as I mentioned, I do have new ones of these, so let me grab them. And as I've learned my lesson over time, I bought two of these things. Now this is definitely brand new, so it's really tight in there. So what the Greasy Hand Garage says is, since you probably don't have that special Churchill tool, you can use an old top hat bushing or a piece of pipe to force the clip down into its groove. So I do have a piece of pipe. I think what I might try to do real quick, even though I think it's going to be fruitless, is to pry this open a little bit and see if I can get it started. But I don't. Even though this is beveled here, I don't really want to smash it down in there, but I might not have a choice. So I do have the pipe that I use for pressing the bearings on and off, if you remember that long white pipe. So that's something to look at. I think the top hat that I do have left that's already cracked, if I try to use that, it's just going to get destroyed. So we'll walk over and see what I got here. Well, that worked pretty well. I think that I can make that one work. All right, I'm going to go get a screwdriver here. Pound it from this side. All right. That was a little easier than I thought it would be, so I got that started. So now we'll drive that home the rest of the way here. Finish it up with the screwdriver. And it's in. Beautiful. So now those turn nice and free. A little bit of a play there, as I would expect. Definitely not too much, so that's good. And now we'll pull this out and we'll put the bottom together. Coming from the other side now, we've got the synchro hub for the third and top gear. It's going to come in like this. Don't forget the synchros themselves. Just setting them in there to start, and that's going to flop around. All right, so that pretty much ends that. And then coming from the other side, we've got the other synchro hub, and this is oriented such that the reverse gear here comes in first to the shaft. Again, don't forget your synchro rings, It's going to fall apart a little bit. I'll get this stuff all wired together here so it doesn't do that to me anymore. So there's that. So there's a conflict here in the Greasy Hands Garage and the workshop manual, at least the way I see it. So the way that I read the workshop manual, actually I can leave this on here. The way I read the workshop manual is this gear goes on like this, with the actual gear pointing backwards. But the picture that at least the way that I see it in the Greasy Hands Garage is not that way. So what I think I can maybe hopefully do is grab the top cover here. First gear still has to go on. It's got to go on over here. I might be able to grab the top cover here because it's got the selector forks on it, and see if I can get that lined up. So right now this is in neutral. And that fits on there just fine. If I turn this thing around, I don't think it's going to fit. Nope, definitely not. I know I'm blocking the light here for you, but it's definitely not going to line up. So, at least in that picture on the Greasy Hands Garage, it's backwards. Let me flip through here and see if I can find a different picture. Greasy Hands Garage got the picture like that. And everything else looks like it lines up right. But that case is definitely not going to go on. Really hate to get this wrong at this point. As much as I hate to doubt. That Greasy Hand Garage, I'm going to turn this guy around, put it on. Put it on the way I think it should be. So, and I just lost the other camera there, as you saw. So let me go ahead and change the battery on that. And then we still got to get first gear on here and some other items. All right, so now it's time for first gear, and it's got first gear going on with the synchro hub obviously towards the synchro. So don't forget to put the synchro on here. And then we've got the spacer. And then first gear and the bushing. Now the bushing's inside here. I'm going to take that off real quick, oil it up. And then put first gear on. So that should be assembled. Now what it tells you to do is to kind of wire it together so the stuff doesn't go falling apart on you like it continually is doing to me. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then grab a bite to eat real quick, actually. And then come back for the input shaft. The input shaft I did not take apart. So that'll be relatively straightforward. And I think we're going to be getting close to getting stuff back in the case. Got the input shaft here, like I had mentioned earlier. I didn't take anything apart, so I don't really have to put anything back together. But you want to check that bearing, obviously, on there. There's a big, huge flat washer that's under there, so if you have to take that bearing off, that washer would come off. Then you have another washer here and then a snap ring. So again, because everything felt good, everything's nice and smooth. It's a little discolored, but nothing chips or anything like that. Because I haven't really played with anything on here, I'm going to leave it as is. There's also roller bearings inside here, and those all look good and nothing's cracked, and all those bearings are in there. Thankfully for that, I don't have to worry about taking that thing out. And then, so we'll set that aside. And then what's up next is we're going to start populating the inside of the case with the countershaft and all that stuff. Next thing up here is to get the cluster gear inside, and I've got what you're looking at here is the rear and front thrust washers. These on the top here are from the overdrive or the non-overdrive gearbox that came out of the car, and these are definitely been replaced. And then the ones here are out of the overdrive transmission, and they don't appear to have been replaced. You can tell that one mainly because these notches that they put into them are nice and clean as compared to the other ones are kind of sort of half-heartedly bent, but these are nice and clean. So the Greasy Hands Garage here does give you thicknesses for these things. That'll tell me how I'm doing here. So I'm going to measure these up. I intend to use the old ones just because they don't they appear fine to me. But we're going to take measurements here real quick. And that's 0.103 or so. So that's definitely fine there. and that one's about 0.065. Let's check the other ones. That's the same, about 0.064, 0.065, and 0.104 or so. What was this one again? Yeah, 0.103 or so. So I'm going to go with the new ones here. The other thing they bring up is that the newest aftermarket ones don't have steel backings. Now these that came out of the cars do have steel backings, so they're fine to use. I just like the look of the original ones better. The other trick here is you've got to get these thrust washers don't want to stay where they're at because these tabs don't really do you any good for holding it in place. So because I have two of everything, including the shaft that the leg gear or the cluster gear runs on, I'm going to come from one end with one of the shafts to try to hold one of these bearings in place, and then come from the other way with the other shaft and come all the way through. And as I get close to the end, hopefully push the other shaft out, and that those bearings will stay in place and not spin or anything like that. And then that will allow me to measure the end float, because if you're not measuring end float in a transmission, I mean, you know, what else are you doing? Another thing to point out here, I'm not really sure that you're going to be able to see it. This is the shaft out of the overdrive transmission, which has never been touched. The thing's never been, at least never rebuilt. I'm convinced of that now. And this is the shaft out of the car's transmission, which I'm convinced has been rebuilt. You can see that heavy line here, and there's actually, like, I can feel that. It might not catch on my fingernail, but that's definitely worn. And again, Greasy Hand Garage, they talk about that, and that's a good wear point. So I'll definitely be using the new shaft out of the car's transmission, but still using this, like I mentioned, to help me get stuff aligned. All right, the lighting's not going to be too great over here. I apologize, but I've got a shaft coming from the inside, and it's just breaking through on there, and this is for the large bearing. I'm going to put some assembly lube, something nice and sticky, on the back of this to help me have it stick. All right, and just barely hanging on that guy. Then I'm going to come with the other side and put some assembly lube on this guy, and then try to drop that shaft down from the front. What would be perfect is if I could stand this case up now, but unfortunately this shaft over here extends beyond the front of the case. No way that I know of to keep that thrust washer up. So what I'm going to do is try to drop this cluster gear in there now, and then use, if it doesn't fall all the way out like it's trying to, use something, screwdriver or something, try to keep it all in place. So the small end of the gear goes towards reverse, towards the back of the case. Make sure this is as tight together as you can get it, because it will slide around on you. Kind of got to go in a little bit crooked, and point something else out to you real quick. Notice how that end is recessed here on these gears. So that's, you want to kind of come in like this. I don't know if this is going to work or not. It's going to be painful. All right, so I've knocked this small bearing down all the way. You can't see the large bearing. I know. I'm sorry that this camera angles are not working. This is not something to lend itself to filming, unfortunately. So what I'm going to do is go ahead, put this bearing in as good as I can, and wherever that other shaft is, get that other shaft, and then slide that in. Now, I don't care as much this time because this is not the final assembly, but this little notch here, back on the assembly, if you remember, there was a plate that slid through there with a screw that held it down. That notch goes to the back of the case. So I'll go ahead and see if I can slide this bearing in. And then you gotta look from the back here to make sure it's aligned. And hopefully get it started. Again, I apologize for not being able to show you this, so it's definitely not easy to show. got lucky there. So essentially all I was using was my my orange stick to try to, you can look in there and see where that bearing sits and kind of get it rotated around properly. So now hopefully I'll start to push out the other shaft here. And it looks like I'm just about there, believe it or not. And holy cow, that worked. So now there's some end float in here and I can hear it. So you stick the feeler gauge down on the small end, and the spec here is 6 to 10 thousandths or 7 to 12, depending on the manual, according to the Greasy Sand Garage. We'll see what my manual says. 7 to 12 is what mine says, so then we'll go get my feeler gauges. Yeah, 12 goes in there with no problem whatsoever. That's unfortunate. Tells you if an end float is too big, you got to add a shim. Now, one thing I will point out is I believe this is a distance piece. So if you can see here, that distance piece is not very well rounded on the inside. It's definitely had some machining and sanding work done on it. I don't know if this was done to reduce the thickness or what. So I took the one off the original countershaft and or lay gear, cluster gear, whatever this thing is called, and it seemed to work out all right. But now we'll see. So I'm going to take this back out, unfortunately. Probably go easier the second time, and then see what the comparisons of this, the distance piece here, and I might have to add a shim, which would be unfortunate because I don't know if you can buy them or if you have to make them. So let's see. So yeah, that took me 2 minutes to do that, not 10 like the last time it did. So now again, we'll with the thicker spacer in here, definitely much less. All right, so the 12 thousandths, whoops, 12 thousandths not fitting at all now. But it's close, feels like anyway. So I'm just gonna go all the way down to 7. I tease myself. And 7 fits with a pretty good rub. So that end float is now sat. Love it, love it. So I don't have to change anything. It was that piece in there, that's fine. And since it's been in there and operated fine, I'm not gonna mess with it. Now the Greasy Hands Garage gets into restoring the bearings and all that kind of stuff, and I've already done that. The one thing that either I missed or that it doesn't talk about, however, is putting in reverse gear. So step 5 is countershaft end float. Step 6 is countershaft assembly. So that end float is good. I don't see anything in there about installing the reverse gear, so I'm going to go ahead and look at the workshop manual for that. But one thing now that's kind of a bummer is that shaft that ran through and held the cluster gear up has now got to come back out. If you remember when we were taking and putting all the big guts in there, you had to drop that out of the way so that you could get the main gears up here, the main shaft gears out of there. Well, that's going to be interesting to try to line these bearings up. I don't quite know how I'm going to do that, but let's look at getting reverse gear in. So again, not the best lighting, but we should be able to get reverse gear in with no problem here. So essentially, kind of hold the gear in here. Now this is the reverse gear actuating arm. So this knob up here is what rides on the selector fork that's in there for reverse. And on the bottom of that, there's another knob, you can't see it. But if you look in here, there's that groove right there cut into this gear. So this groove rides on that knob. And as that pivots back and forth, that moves that in and out on that shaft. And that's what engages reverse gear. So we'll go ahead, get this oiled up a little bit just to make again, there's a notch in this shaft too. So you want to make sure that notch, is towards the back. So now you just kind of got to get it right where you line up the notch that rides on this guy and the shaft all at the same time. There you go. I'm sure you cannot see a bit of this, and I think maybe, unfortunately, I do have to have cluster gear out first. Maybe not. You didn't see that at all, sorry, but that worked. So now that gear will slide back and forth, and it just engages with the reverse in the other gears. So now we're going to pull this shaft out from the cluster gear, and that's going to drop, unfortunately. And it's what the workshop manual tells you to do, but without doing that, you can't get the main clusters of gears in. And now that'll drop. And there you go. Alright, it's been a couple days, so the editing transition might not be great, but I got the cluster gear in there, I got the reverse gear in there, and also what I did with the reverse gear with the shaft is I put back in the little holder piece here. I've got a new metal plate and a new screw coming from Moss, but that way that'll prevent this reverse shaft from moving around on you. And what we're going to do now is take the mass of gears that I got here, get them into the case, just kind of slide it in kind of crooked so that it falls in there. So get that in, and then we're going to come with the rear bearing, this guy right here. And with that now, we're going to go over to the press and press that in to the case. So what the Greasy Hands Garage shows is essentially you put the transmission with the end belt up. This will get into the press and pressed against, and then you come through with from the end bell side and press on the top of the shaft here and press so the whole thing moves and the bearing stays stationary. You press that all the way down. So we're going to go over to the press to do that. The other thing that it mentions is getting this piece of wire off before that happens. So I think what I'm going to do is once I get it set up in the press and everything, I'll get the wire off so that I don't, so I can get it out of there. And then the reverse gear itself, it also talks about wiring that so it stays in the rear position. So I'm going to grab a piece of wire real quick and just run it through one of these bolt holes or something that's all the way through, just to keep that thing stationary. So that's what's up, and I'll see you over at the press. So not a big fan of what's about to happen here, but I took a hammer and that piece of wood, not this pipe, but just a hammer and a piece of wood, and started that bearing into the case, trying to make it as level as I could. Now that pretty much what's happening is now the shaft is starting to seat on the inner portion of the bearing. So now I got to put this transmission in here, but you got to do end bell up like I mentioned, and it's going to balance on this little itty bitty pipe here, and that just a little death defying. So I think what I'm going to have to do is stand it up and get the press started so it gets some tension on it, and then hope everything's straight and all that kind of stuff. So this is going to be a little nerve-wracking, I think. All right, well, still makes me nervous, but I think we're okay. All right, so that's going in pretty easy, actually. Make sure that nothing is binding here. Stuff has got the ability to turn, and now we'll look at getting this piece of wire out. The lighting probably is horrible right now, so I apologize for that. A pair of wire cutters here. Hopefully this thing don't fall over. Well, hopefully I didn't push this in too far. But now I can't get that wire out. That would be rather embarrassing, but I think that might be exactly what I did. So let me, it even tells you in the Greasy Hand Garage, don't do this. So let me undo this tension here, and I'll get it over to the workbench. Let's see if I can get that wire out of there. All right, obviously I was able to get the wire out, and it also enabled me to check these gears to make sure everything was free rolling and everything. Remember, you still got that cluster gear under there. So you don't want to just go gangbusters for this, because you could very easily probably chip a tooth here. So I don't want that to happen, but everything rotated freely. All right, so now it's getting a little tight, and I want to make sure that I'm not pinching anything. So a lot of iterations of this. Eventually, this the shaft will be fully seated on the bearing, and then the bearing will start going into the case. So I'm not going to bore you with it back and forth, but again, just make sure that you're not pinching anything. You don't got that cluster gear in the way, and you're not going to chip anything. That ended up being a lot harder than it needed to be. The hub here got kind of hung up, and it wouldn't slide back in. And I went to slide it back in, and the hub came out from the synchro, and all the balls fell into the case. So I had to take the thing all the way back out. But important safety tip, and what I had forgotten and what I had missed, and if that hadn't happened, I would not have caught it, is there's a thrust washer behind this first gear here that goes between the first gear and the case that I had bagged up with the bearing instead of with the first gear. So I had missed that, and when I was putting it in, I was getting a lot of rubbing here between the first gear and the case, which didn't kind of make sense to me. So I investigated a little bit further, and sure enough, I figured out that that guy wasn't here. So that's in now, so I pressed it all the way down. The other thing I did is my wooden pedestal that I keep the overdrive on, this guy here, it's got the hole in it so the overdrive shaft could go through. I ended up mounting the gearbox on that, standing up with bell end up, and that allowed me, even though it's made out of wood, that allowed me to press that in home far enough. And then a little bit of the bearing sticking out, and that Greasy Hands Garage talks about it, and I just drove the bearing in with a piece of wood and a hammer. And then there's another washer at the end of that here, and then the snap ring. So all that's together, spins pretty freely, pretty good. Reverse didn't get in my way or anything, and more importantly, reverse also engages with this gear. If you remember in my previous video, I was concerned that the gear was going in backwards, and I also put the top cover on, and it seems just fine. So everything should be together now. Now the trick is going to be to get the shaft in for the cluster gear. So we're going to go ahead and try that. So next up, again, like I had mentioned, you got to get the shaft in for the cluster gear, and there's a little notch cut in it, so you want to make sure that that notch is pointing out, because that's what it's going to get locked in with your reverse gear shaft. The trick here is that, one, you got the thrust washers in the way, right? So, but it's there's enough play there where you can slide that around, so even if it totally, comes undone, it's not going to fall away. You're not going to lose it in there, at least I don't think so. But you can see that the hole, no, actually, can you see? Just barely, maybe. The light's not great here, of course. You now have the countershaft that's depressed and sunk down to the bottom of the case, so you probably just saw me move that. So what I've got to do is try to get that lined up such that I can get the thing started and get this shaft started through, and hopefully allow it to go. So I'm just sticking my finger in there and kind of moving it around, and then turning the main shaft, and that allows that gear to line up. And actually, I think I just did it. Not as hard as I thought it was going to be. Yep, sure did. That was a lot easier than I thought it was going to be. But now I've got the front, and that went right in, and there it went. So that entirely too easy, more easy than I thought it would be. Not a lot to it. That's how the workshop manual gets it. Again, I think just turning and agitating the gears and trying to let them find their own spot kind of helps. So I'm going to take this plate off, and I do have a full one from the old gearbox I mentioned that I have some on the way. So I'm going to take that off so I can get the full engagement there, so I don't lose the shafts in the box or anything. And then we'll put the transmission back down and go from the front. All right, so that's in, and the shaft is in, and I got the cluster gear turning when I turn the transmission. You might notice here I got a piece of lock wire in the front, and what was happening is as I was moving the case around, the synchro ring here and this whole thing wanted to slide off the end, and it won't clear the large gear, but it was, I didn't want to start turning something and maybe chip or anything or whatever, so I just put this piece of wire in just to provide some capture here. But now I've got the input shaft that needs to go in, and the Greasy Hands Garage doesn't talk about it at all, or if it does, I'm not seeing it. Oh, no, I take that back. Now install the input shaft assembly and the 4th gear synchro ring, which was this guy that I've been holding on here. All right, again, as I had mentioned, I didn't take this thing apart at all. There's a bearing, there's a snap ring in here, and a spacer. There's a large spacer inside. And again, I didn't take any of it apart, so I don't expect any of it to bother me. And obviously, I'm also going to need to pull that piece of wire out. So let's do that real quick. So that, again, that slip ring, or excuse me, that front synchro ring does not need to be on there until you're ready to put this in. Also, real quick, there's roller bearings in here, so you want to take a good gander at your roller bearings, make sure those are good. And mine are, thankfully. There you go. Important safety tip. I can't get the input shaft in because this gear is interfering with the large lay gear there, the cluster gear. So I'm going to have to backtrack a little bit. So I'm going to come back. I'm going to pull that shaft back out, let that thing drop, and then install this bearing. So there you go. Not paying attention. So I pulled that shaft back out and the lay gear, or the cluster gear dropped. So now it's just a matter of putting this guy in. So now that'll go in and fits in just fine. And then the bearing gets pressed into the case, and it's not that difficult. So I'll just use my pipe here. Make sure that the bearing and the ring, the snap ring that the bearing's on, all get flushed up against the case there. And again, spin everything. All right, spinning really nice and smooth. Don't hear any noises or anything like that. Even works in reverse. All right, so now we'll go ahead and stand it back up like I just did a couple minutes ago. We'll put that shaft back in. Hopefully everything lines up and nice and easy like it did last time. So as you can see, I've got the top cover on, and I was still a little nervous about that one gear that I have it on backwards as compared to the Greasy Hands Garage. So put the top cover on, that'll allow me to shift stuff. So I just wanted to go ahead. So I'm going to turn the input shaft up here, and you can see right now it's in neutral. So I've got my hand on the input shaft, and no matter what I do back here, it's fine. So we'll go to first, and I can shift it into first. All right, now it's locked, and then when I spin it in the clockwise direction, or whichever way I'm going, counterclockwise, you can see that that spins in the same way, and there's obviously going to be gears there. Second, looks good. Third, looks good. And fourth, and that looks good. Now the big test is going to be reverse. So reverse is you lift and down into the to the back here. So there's reverse, and I'm turning it, and the output shaft is turning in the opposite direction. So I don't think if I had this backwards, that would be working. So good deal. Proof of concept. So the gearbox, or at least should work. At least the gearbox itself. Now, obviously, I haven't gotten the overdrive on there yet. That's coming up here in a little bit. But I think I'm going to stop the video here because this is a convenient spot, and I've done a lot of work, and I don't want to drag you guys along too long as I've been doing lately. So we're going to cut it here, and next up will be to get the overdrive on, and then get the thing, get some oil in there, and hopefully get to testing. So thanks for watching. Have a good rest of your day. Cheers.